Welcome to Backwards Compatible, the video game retrospective podcast where we discuss, analyze, and reflect on some of the most notable and varied titles in gaming history. I'm your host, Chase.
And I'm Garrett.
Wow. Wow.
What's that noise?
It's Crash Bandicoot, baby! How do you like that now, Plumber Boy?
I don't think Plumber Boy likes it.
No, he doesn't. We're here to talk about Crash Bandicoot, specifically the first 3 games released on the PlayStation back in the late 90s. We got Crash Bandicoot 2, Cortex Strikes Back, and Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped, or just Crash Bandicoot Warped. I don't think it's technically called 3, but, you know. Alright, so I guess we should start with our familiarity with this franchise. You want to go first?
Sure. So, really my familiarity with this, I haven't actually played too much Crash Bandicoot. The only time I ever really played it was when I was a young kid over at someone's house, which was basically a daycare center at the time. I played with the younger brother's PlayStation, and I played Crash Bandicoot 2, I believe. Yeah, it was Crash Bandicoot 2, and I really didn't get too far because, you know, a 4-year-old kid who never really played any other video games outside of maybe some Madden or Off-Road Fury, just not really too much to go on. But I have done a quick skim in college fashion, and I'll try my hardest and diddly darnest to really analyze this from an outside perspective.
Yeah, he waited until we just started recording to actually do his homework on the legacy of the Crash Bandicoot lore.
I know, and that is my fault.
Well, fear not, dear listeners, because I, at the very least, did my due diligence, and I played through the first 3 games on my PS1 back home, so I at least can carry this somewhat.
Yeah, pretty much. It's just going to be Chase's episode because he is like the sage when it comes to this series. Whereas me, I am just a tiny human in his mere presence.
Alright, well, for me at least, I can honestly say I think Crash Bandicoot might be my earliest video game memory, at least the first one that I can clearly remember playing. So, when I was very young, I want to say 4, 5 years old-ish, I remember going over to my cousin's house, my older cousins, and they had a PS1, or just a PlayStation, and one of the games that I always saw them playing was Crash Bandicoot. I want to say it was the original, but it could have been 2, because I do have a lot of attachment to Crash Bandicoot 2. I remember always watching them play, and of course, in cousin fashion, I would always ask, "Can I play, please?" And they'd always say, "No, Chase, get your own game." But eventually, one day, they relented, and they handed me the controller, and I started playing through Crash Bandicoot, and I was terrible at it. I was like 4 years old, so not the dedicated pro gamer I am you see before you today.
Okay, so how many times did you have to ask the cousins to let you play this game?
I can't really remember. I mean, it was 20-something years ago, but I do remember it was a good minute before they finally were like, fine, if this will get you to shut up, you crybaby. I do remember that after a while of always asking to play Crash Bandicoot, and after they did let me play, even though I could barely do anything with it, I was slightly getting better each time, and I always kept asking, so eventually, I think when my cousins got a PlayStation 2, they gave me their PlayStation 1, at least temporarily, because I don't remember having it for very long. And with it, they gave me Crash Bandicoot 2, Crash Bandicoot Warped, alongside a few other games. I think Tony Hawk Pro Skater was one of the other games, but I digress.
Quite a lineup, actually, considering the history and notoriety of those games.
Yeah, and I think there were a couple other kid PS1 games they gave me, but I can't remember off the top of my head what they were. But Crash Bandicoot and Tony Hawk Pro Skater are the ones that I definitely remember. Anyway, so 2 and 3 for Crash are the ones I have the most familiarity with. While I did play 1 back in the day, it's the one that I have the least childhood nostalgia for. Although years later in high school, I did eventually go back and replay all 3 PS1 games. And, of course, for the purposes of this podcast episode, I recently replayed all 3 of them.
Yeah, so wait, how long did it take you to play all 3 of them?
Crash Bandicoot 1 I didn't technically beat, because I just got about halfway through the game and was like, okay, I think I've refreshed enough on this one. Crash Bandicoot 2 I actually got by pretty quick, I think just a couple days. And Crash Bandicoot 3 took me a few days as well. Overall, they're fairly short games, but I was able to bust through them pretty quick. Alright, so with all of that said, let's talk about the actual history and development of this series. So the original game, Crash Bandicoot, was developed by Naughty Dog. It is kind of funny after playing through their more recent games like Uncharted, The Last of Us, going back to their more humble origins with the crazy critter Crash.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of amazing how somebody such as Naughty Dog went from being a simple platforming based video game company to something more of a grander scale where with like The Last of Us, like the first game Last of Us was just revolutionary. So it's really nice to delve deep into the history of these game development companies because I feel sort of like excitement and nostalgia going back.
So how this series came to be is that Naughty Dog was approached by Universal Interactive Studios, who wanted to get in on the whole video game craze that was going on. They were like, hey, you guys show a lot of potential. How would you like to make a trilogy of games for us? And it was pretty appropriate for the timing as well, because the newly developed PlayStation had just hit the console market, and they were looking for their own Mario, their own Sonic the Hedgehog. They wanted their own mascot to compete, something to really drive in the kiddies and look at a PlayStation and say, that's the Crash Bandicoot console.
That was the blank console until they finally made Crash Bandicoot. Gotta keep the chronology in order.
Exactly.
But really, right now, I don't know. I never really thought of PlayStation associated with Crash Bandicoot. That just might be me.
Let's just say after the PS1, the Crash series took a bit of a quality dive. So the first game released on September 9th, 1996 in North America. Those of you who were around probably remember, but the marketing for this game was a little on the aggressive side, particularly towards Nintendo, as was the style at the time.
It kind of had that cops vibe, didn't it?
Yeah, there was one where it's like guys robbing a convenience store wearing the Aku Aku mask, and it's the police interview afterwards, like, what is he doing?
It's just great.
And of course, there's the very famous guy in a crash suit standing outside of Nintendo headquarters with a megaphone just yelling at Nintendo about how much their characters suck.
Damn plumber boy. Gosh, I
Right.
can't get that quote out of my head.
The Crash Bandicoot series in general has a history of very weird marketing, but that's a whole other discussion. So, like I said, Crash Bandicoot as a character was conceptualized to be a mascot character for PlayStation. The reason why they went with a bandicoot of all animals is because it was considered a very cute and cuddly looking animal, but also fairly unknown. Like, before Crash, how many people can say they know what a bandicoot even is? Outside of Australia, that is.
Yeah, I can definitely say when I first played Crash, I kind of thought he was just an orange raccoon. I didn't know a bandicoot was an actual living thing.
Yeah, it's like a rodent of some sort, I think. Before the name Crash Bandicoot was settled on, the first name for him was Willy the Wombat.
Willy the Wombat.
That was the development name for Crash Bandicoot.
The Wombat. I can't imagine a wombat with it. I mean, glad that they stuck with the bandicoot, but then the surrounding theme of the game, which was sort of like a Hawaii or at least Pacific Islands
Australia.
type feel. Was it really Australia? That didn't really feel Australian to me.
I mean, it is kind of, I guess you could say, a stereotypical depiction of the outback, the Australian way of life, quote unquote, because, you know, you got the didgeridoo music, you got a lot of Australian wildlife as the enemies of the game. Other than that, though, it's a very theme park version of Australia. Also, another fun fact I found while doing research for this game, the reason why Crash was made mute, like he doesn't really talk, is because the developers hated the idea of a video game protagonist talking too much.
I'm looking at you, Mario.
Mario doesn't even talk that much. I'm talking about characters like Gex.
Gex.
Another fun fact, the guy who did the music for the series, Josh Mansell, he's from Michigan.
Really? I don't really hear too many people becoming famous from the Michigan area.
Yeah, for all you listeners out there, we are a Michigan-based podcast.
But we do have some nice songs that came out from us, such as like the Edmund Fitzgerald, which is a very famous song that's heard throughout the U.S., as well as the Dogman. The Dogman is a very famous myth, but we won't go into the history of Michigan.
Speaking of anthropomorphic dog people.
Speaking of it.
Getting to the plot of the first Bandicoot game, if you can really call it that, the first Crash game doesn't have too much story, but for what it is, the plot begins with Dr. Neo Cortex, genetically altering the wildlife of Australia to become his evil army of doom. However, much like Oppenheimer before him, Cortex failed to realize the power he had just unleashed within Crash Bandicoot, who manages to escape by jumping out the window of Cortex's castle. Immediately afterwards, though, Cortex isn't too concerned. He just says, "Prepare the female Bandicoot." Yeah, let's talk about Tawna in this game, Crash's girlfriend.
Coming into people's awakenings. Oh no.
Alright, furry jokes aside, let's talk about Tawna's personality. Great discussion. That was Tawna, everybody.
Yeah, that was Tawna.
Yeah, so unfortunately, Tawna in the first game is the damsel in distress. She is the female Bandicoot character who is just there to be rescued by Crash. She doesn't even talk, she doesn't do anything, she's just there. I understand it was the mid-90s, but I mean, come on. In the Insane trilogy, at least, they do give her a bit more agency, a 1% more agency, in that she does fight back from being captured again in the beginning cutscene, but other than that, there's not much to say about her in the first game. Although, of course, I would be remiss to not mention that 20 years later in Crash 4, It's About Time, they redesigned her appearance, but gave her way more agency and badass personality. So at least now she's a real character.
You can now consider her as part of crew. I mean, considering the characters, Crash is your silent, all action orientated type of guy.
Anyway, Crash just has to traverse over several different islands, defeating Cortex's various henchmen that he throws at you, just making your way across, and eventually to Cortex's castle. You fight Cortex on top of a giant airship. Eventually you defeat Cortex by destroying his jetpack and sending him plummeting to his doom, and Crash and Tawna have a happily ever after, never to see Cortex again. So the next game in the series is called Cortex Strikes Back. Real quick before getting into 2, though, there's not too much to say about the first Crash Bandicoot game. It is a little more of its time. Like, there's a really weird way to save your progress in that game where every few levels you have to collect 3 Tawna icons hidden in boxes, and once you've collected all 3, you get sent to a bonus level, and if you make it to the end of that bonus level, then you can save your game progress. So if you lost all your lives before getting to that point, you're just gonna have to go back to your last save, which could have been several levels behind.
Oh god, that sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah, fortunately in 2, they replaced it with an actual save progress that you can do at any time. But while we're here, Crash Bandicoot 1, obviously it set the standard for what the Crash gameplay would be. A 3D platformer, but it's done from a behind perspective of Crash for most levels. It's Crash running forward, dodging various obstacles, defeating enemies, jumping on crates, collecting wumpa fruits and Aku Aku masks. Winnabaga! There are a few levels that mix it up a bit, though. There's a few where he's running from a giant boulder running towards him, where he's moving towards the camera instead, and you can't really tell what's ahead of you, so you gotta make it up as you go. And of course, there's the boss levels. There's a few interesting bosses in the first game. We got Papu Papu, the chief of the native tribe, and yeah, the depiction of the natives in this game is a little on the questionable side, but that's neither here nor there. There's Ripperoo, a kangaroo that's just completely insane in a straitjacket. I like him, he's fun. Koala Kong, he's just a buff koala, and he's gonna throw dynamite and boulders at you.
That sounds like a Giga Chad in the making.
Koala Kong, the Giga Chad. There's Pinstripe, a Potoroo with a Thompson gun. He's like a 1930s mafia gangster, and he's just shooting you down as you have to dodge him and hit him when he's vulnerable.
I can say, looking at Pinstripe, he really does know how to dress.
Dress to impress. And then finally, there's Dr. Neo Cortex and his lab assistant, Dr. Nitrous Brio, or N.Brio. Get it? I actually really like the N.Brio fight. He summons various blob monsters from his science concoctions to fight for him, and then once you've dealt enough damage to him, he'll drink a tonic, transforming into a Hulk-like monster, so yeah, that one's a pretty fun fight. As for Cortex, there's not too much to say about his final boss fight. He's basically just shooting lasers as he's flying above you. You have to shoot the green-colored laser blast back at him. I thought it was kind of a nice gag where, as the fight progresses, he's shooting more and more laser blasts at you, and a few different variant ones. And then finally you think, okay, the final wave, this is going to be the most intense part of the fight yet. He just shoots a green bolt at you, which you can immediately reflect back at him.
All that build up just for kind
Darn
of
you, Crash Bandicoot.
yeah.
Crash is a fairly straightforward platformer game. It didn't have to be some major Elden Ring level boss fight or anything. That's the thing though. I feel like in all three games, Cortex is one of the more least interesting boss fights. Usually his main minions tend to have more interesting mechanics to them. In the later games, Dr. Ingen's boss fights are really cool, and Cortex is just sort of bog standard boss fight. Moving on to Crash Bandicoot 2.
Animal abuse.
Yes, instead of Cortex Strikes Back, it should have just been Crash Bandicoot, abuse all the animals. Like, why can you jump on a polar bear's head in the hub world to gain lives? Like, what kind of messed up mechanic is that? That poor polar bear cub.
Uh-huh. And then not to mention you kick seals into oblivion.
Yeah, Crash Bandicoot 2, released in North America on October 31st, 1997, Halloween.
Ooh, spooky. All you spooky seasoners out there, just be patient.
So, the plot with the second game begins immediately after the first one, with Cortex falling from his airship and he crash lands in a crystal cave. Cortex, now voiced by Clancy Brown of Mr. Krabs and Lex Luthor fame, he then realizes the potential of the crystals, and cut to 1 year later where he's completed his latest doomsday weapon, the Cortex Vortex, alongside his new assistant, Dr. Engine.
Tell me more about this engine guy.
Well, apparently the missile attached to his head is an unexploded nuclear bomb, so make of that what you will.
Oh, so he really is the son of a bitch.
Yeah, so because Engine replaced Brio as Cortex's main henchman, I like to imagine he had some questions about anthropomorphizing various animals, like, Dr. Cortex, I found your blueprints for the Tana specimen on DeviantArt.
I can tell you this much, bud. When you were spewing out that stuff, I ain't got nothing. You're like a high priest preaching to a commoner here.
Right. What's interesting about the second game's plot is it's Cortex himself that sends Crash out to locate the crystals that he can't locate on Earth because he doesn't have most of his henchmen anymore. So he basically tricks Crash into believing that Cortex is on his side and is building the Cortex Vortex to save the world and needs the crystals to power it. So for most of the game, Crash is assuming Cortex has become a good guy. Of course, throughout the game, it's very obvious Cortex has no such intentions and that he is really just playing Crash for a fool, something of which his sister Coco, who, by the way, let's talk about Coco while we're here.
Oh, Coco.
I feel like she was made as not entirely as an apology to how bad the female representation of Tana was, but I do like Coco as a character. Crash's younger sister, she's the brains of the operation. She's got her trusty laptop with her, and she serves as mission control for Crash throughout the second game.
Not to mention she can talk, and that Crash can't. Let's see if he can do that.
Yeah, I always thought that was weird. Like, why can Coco talk, but Crash can't? Also, I'm not sure if it's ever made clear, but was Coco also part of Cortex's experiments in evolving the animals, or was she just born already human-like, or I don't know. The Crash Bandicoot lore runs very deep. A cool thing I liked about this game is that there's two different endings, although it's more accurate to say there's the standard ending and then there's the 100% true ending. After you defeat Cortex at the end of Crash Bandicoot 2, which isn't really a boss fight so much as like a boss race where you're flying through an asteroid belt on a jetpack and you have to catch up to Cortex and hit him when you get next to him. And once you've done that a number of times, you send him through a wormhole and with his jetpack destroyed, assumingly defeating him. Oh, and can I just say, man, this fight was annoying because I don't think the jetpack controls have aged all that well, so getting a handle on them was a bit of a hassle. You're also under a time limit because if you can't beat Cortex before he gets to the end of the asteroid belt, then you just instantly lose and have to start all over again. However, after you defeat Cortex, Coco reminds you that the Cortex Vortex, the Doomsday weapon, is still operational and floating above the Earth. So she's encouraging you to go out and collect all of the hidden gems in each of the levels. Upon doing so, Nitrous Brio, Cortex's former henchman, contacts you and says he'll destroy the Cortex Vortex for you with the power of the gems you've just located. So that unlocks the true ending where Crash and Brio team up and shoot a giant laser at Cortex's space station, destroying its wreckage, sending it to the Earth.
Oh, sending it to the Earth. I'm sure no damage will ever be done to anyone ever.
Right, it totally won't unleash an ancient evil upon the world. No sirree, Bob.
No, I don't think so. I think that's kind of stretching it, don't you think?
With Cortex Strikes Back, they also introduced vehicle segments. There's a water jet board you can ride in certain levels, and of course there's the jetpack that you can fly around in at certain times. Also, they introduced a few new movement options for Crash. He can now slide and do body slams, and going back to Crash 1, it was so weird not having those abilities. I think the slide especially is such a useful ability that it makes you wonder how the first game ever got by without it.
Yeah, it seems like there were a lot of like small crevices that it would be more beneficial to go through. And I feel like that would add another dynamic. Because not to mention, they already had the positive Y axis, if you will care for my explanation, because they already had left, right, forward, back, and up. But they never really had down when you're just running on the ground.
A few more of Cortex's henchmen that serve as boss fights that come into prominence later. We got Tiny Tiger. He basically replaces Koala Kong as like the buff henchman in this game and in the third one. And I like him a bit more. I feel like a giant Tony the Tiger knockoff is a little more intimidating than a Giga Chad Koala.
I can get behind that.
Another boss fight that's really only in this game are the Komodo brothers. They're Komodo dragons wearing ancient armor and they're throwing scimitars at you. Pretty straightforward boss fight, and they never really come back. Also, Ripperoo makes a return as like a college professor when you start the boss fight, and then he goes back to being insane, so that's a fun little character note.
I love it when games do sort of like those callbacks.
On the subject of animal abuse, I don't know if this is just me reading into it, but I feel like the Crash Bandicoot games have a somewhat slight environmentalist message behind them. Like, I don't think this is necessarily what Naughty Dog had in mind when making the Crash games, but I feel like there's a kind of a message of science gone wrong, messing with wildlife and nature, and it kind of taking on a life of its own to exact a form of revenge. I don't know, I feel like there's something there. This was the 90s, keep in mind, and environmentalism was a very popular message to be running in a lot of media back then, which I, for one, think we should bring back more these days. I think we could do with a little more environmentalist messaging.
Yeah, I think the indie games usually take care of messages like that compared to AAA. Usually AAA kind of wants to kick out the next big hit or next reminiscent hit. I'm looking at you, Call of Duty.
With Crash 2, the animation also got a nice new jolt of life to it. Crash's model has been upgraded, and he's way more expressive and animated than he was in the first game. I especially like the victory animation he does whenever he defeats a boss or locates a hidden gem, compared to the first game where he just jumps in the air and does a yeehaw!
You just eat your last haw.
You just yeed your last haw, partner.
You gotta give it a little bit of drag, but yeah.
Alright, so I guess we'll move on to the final game of the original trilogy, Crash Bandicoot. Warped! You gotta love that 90s sense of extremism! This is the first one where I feel like Naughty Dog really starts having fun with this series because, I mean, gameplay-wise, the first two are fun, but they felt a little grounded in comparison.
Definitely restrained too, because it felt like they were kind of afraid to take a jump or take a leap of faith.
Right, like, yeah, there's some wackiness. It's, haha, crazy, kooky animals fighting an evil scientist, but with 3, the main plot of 3 is, okay, let's get into this. So, Crash Bandicoot Warped, released on October 31st, 1998, so a full year later than the second game, which in a turn was a year later than the first game. I just find that kind of cool that they managed to pump out 3 solid games all within the span of a year of each other.
Think about it. They didn't really have to change the formula too much. I mean, with the first and second one, they kind of made some little tricks to it. And I feel like the third one, they capitalized on what was already there.
Yeah, I mean, the first 2 games do have a lot of similarities. There's not too much of a shakeup gameplay-wise from 1 to 2. There are a lot new touches and, of course, new characters, but 3 is where the gameplay really does get a shakeup with the vehicle segments. But right before we get into that, Aku Aku, the mask that you've been picking up in the first 2 games as a sort of shield, he is now fully voiced by Mel Winkler, rest in peace, and is now his own character. So I like with each game we got a new character. We got Coco in 2, and now we got Aku Aku in 3, and I really like Mel Winkler's performance. I just think Aku Aku's voice is so calm and reassuring. He really does sound like a very supportive father figure. Wunderbaga.
Yeah, I'm sure that sounds like a very supportive father figure.
Wunderbaga has been living in my head rent-free for 20 odd years.
That sounds like quite an existence, Chase. Do you need to talk?
Now that I think about it, I feel like the Aku Aku mask is like the good equivalent of Majora's mask, but going off topic. So the story of 3, much like the second one, it begins immediately where the last game left off. The debris of the Cortex Vortex crashes down into a cave, and it awakens Aku Aku's evil twin brother, Uka Uka. And he goes up to Cortex and was like, hey, you kind of suck at the whole evil overlord thing. Here's an idea. You do whatever I say, and I, A, won't kill you, and B, will finally get those darn bandicoots. So Cortex and Uka Uka team up. And Uka Uka introduces the third main villain, I guess you could call him, of this game, Dr. Nefarious Tropy, or Entropy. So Entropy builds a time machine for Cortex and Uka Uka to travel back in time and find the crystals back in their original form. So basically, it's the plot of Avengers Endgame, but with bandicoots.
I think Marvel needs to have a talk with PlayStation on that.
Naughty Dog's gonna sue somebody. So with 3, you're going through all various different time periods. You got medieval England, ancient Egypt, the Ice Age, the dinosaur era. Dinosaur baby, look at the dinosaur baby!
That's a cute dinosaur baby.
And then there's the distant future. I personally really enjoy the 1950s motorcycle levels where you race along Route 66. I thought those were really cool. I especially liked the fun touch of the billboards having Cortex dressed as a roadside sheriff, and it just reminded me of the whole no anime meme. I do think with Warped is where Naughty Dog really started having fun with this franchise. It's stuff like that just feels so much more wacky and silly, which I think the Crash Bandicoot series thrives on. Also in Warped, you can play as Coco for the first time. Well, kinda sorta. In most of the vehicle levels, Coco shows up instead of Crash and pilots the vehicle instead, so you're kinda playing as her. Although there's a couple levels where you ride on the back of a tiger along the Great Wall of China, and again, the Chinese levels are a little on the yikes side in terms of their depiction of ancient China, but when you get to the end, compared to Crash, like whenever Crash would ride an animal in the previous games, he just looks at the camera with a mischievous grin like, you thinking what I'm thinking? And then he just jumps on the back of an animal and forces it to be his steed. Whereas with Coco, when she gets to the end of the tiger level, she gets off, she hugs the tiger, gives it a nice little nuzzle, and yeah, she's a lot more considerate to wildlife than her brother.
Where she's just like an angel on Earth. Crash is he's actually a pro gamer in disguise.
Yeah, the way they treat their wild brethren is not too kindly, at least in Crash's case. You could make the argument that Crash and Coco are animals themselves, but it's like, okay, we have evolved. We are of a higher level than these peasants.
That's probably what Crash was thinking through his mind when he first jumped on an animal.
Some animals are more equal than others. But moving on, halfway through the game you defeat Entropy, and without him, the time machine starts going a bit haywire. More on that when we get to Cortex. You defeat Injun again, and I have to say, Injun's boss fights, especially in Warp, are so cool. In the second game, he's just kind of piloting a big robot mech and shooting missiles at you. And he does that again in 3, but not only is his mech suit bigger, it's flying through space, and you're playing as Coco piloting a starfighter shooting lasers at him in a pseudo Star Fox level setup. It's really cool.
Yeah, with that battle, it definitely looked like a little bit difficult as well. Me personally, I love difficult bosses with flavor, and I can tell that Engine was very loved boss fight.
Injun's a fun character. I like the decision to have him have the sort of like Igor, mad scientist, lab assistant accent, the yes, of course, mister. Yeah, not the best example, but you know what I mean. It's that creepy, it's that old-timey accent.
Mm-hmm. I know what you mean.
I also like how Injun uses computer terminology. Like, he doesn't say kill or destroy, he says deleted, obsolete. And given that this was the mid to late 90s, internet tech was either nerd speak or so totally radical, dude. Another thing that stood out to me with Warped is the animation once again got a visual overhaul. Not too big of a difference, but characters like Cortex definitely have much more expression to their faces, and Uka Uka and Aku Aku's facial animations were pretty impressive for the time period, I have to say.
Yeah, definitely not something that I would expect coming out from 1998. It's definitely was a leap forward to, in kind of like a bridge, I feel, upon many other games.
Going back to gameplay mechanics, Warp goes back to the vehicle levels that 2 kinda toyed with, but expands on them tenfold. Like I said, there's the motorcycle racing levels where you have to finish first in each race. There's the World War I airplane levels where Crash and Coco hop into a World War I era triplane and just fly around shooting down bombers while avoiding enemy planes. So that's pretty fun. There's the jet ski levels where Coco sails around various islands avoiding pirate ships and sea mines and sharks. There's also a couple underwater scuba levels, and I don't know what it is about the music in those levels, but replaying them again, it brought back memories. Like, the scuba level music just took me right back to those days, man.
Yeah, music can definitely have a huge impact. And what I could tell, they had great music composition as well as a balance of sometimes what would seem like fast drums are playing to get kind of like your blood pumping to something that's kind of just meant to make you relax and take back.
Yeah, I gotta give props to Josh Mansell. He did the music for all three as the main composer, and he did a really bang up job. Each music theme fits the level and just really gives a sense of the kind of adventure Crash is going on. The main theme, Insanity Beach from the first game, it just nails the kind of vibe Crash Bandicoot games are going for. It's silly and wacky and just full of charm. And finally, for gameplay change-ups that Warped introduced, it's the first game that introduces full-on ability upgrades. Every time you defeat a boss in Warped, you get a new ability. The first couple are fairly simple. You got like a super body slam, you get a double jump, which personally I didn't really find all that useful. Like, most of the jumps in Crash Bandicoot 3 are already pretty tailored to the first jump. The double jump just gives you a little extra airtime, so not a useless ability, but doesn't really shake it up. But one of the later upgrades you get, I think after defeating Injun, is you get the Fruit Bazooka.
The Fruit Bazooka.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
It's a bazooka that shoots wumpa fruits, and it can one-shot every normal enemy in the game, or at least most of them. So playing through the game with the fruit bazooka, it just makes combat so easy. Like, you just stand far away, pull out the bazooka, and just fire wildly at the enemies, and you just erase them from existence. It made playing through the later levels a breeze, at least as far as the enemies are concerned.
Mm-hmm. You still had to do your parkour.
Yeah, like, you still had to dodge obstacles and make jumps and all that, but in terms of enemies to overcome, the Fruit Bazooka makes every fight easy peasy. Also, a few shoutouts to the bosses in this one. Tiny Tiger makes his return, this time as a gladiator in the Roman Colosseum, so that's pretty cool. This is the first game where Dingodile makes his entrance. He becomes a fairly prominent recurring boss fight in the later games, and in Crash Bandicoot 4 you can even play as him. Also, Dingodile is very firmly Aussie. I really like Dr. Entropy's boss fight. I like how he switches up the battlefield as you're fighting him. He'll teleport locations every time you hit him.
And I'm guessing, of course, there were like obstacles you had to jump around in order to get to him every time he did teleport, which probably made it kind of dynamic because you're kind of like seeing him off in the distance.
Right, and there's the nice touch that every time he teleports, he's not teleporting through space, he's teleporting through time, because the background of the fight changes time periods. Like, you go from the distant future to Imperial China, ancient Egypt, and all that, so that's just really fun. You're fighting entropy through time, not space.
Ooh, that's actually pretty awesome.
And then you have the final boss fight against Dr. Cortex and Uka Uka, and even though I talked trash about Cortex boss fights for the first two games because they were kind of underwhelming, this final boss fight, to 5-year-old me, was the definition of epic showdown. Because while you as Crash are fighting Cortex, your standard, he's shooting lasers and throwing bombs at you and you have to knock him over, Aku Aku and his brother Uka Uka are having their own little anime battle. So not only do you have to keep your eye on Cortex the whole time, but you also have to keep in mind where Aku Aku and Uka Uka are fighting, because if you get caught in the crossfire between them, you will take damage.
Oh, that sounds awesome. Like a fun little dynamic they decided to sprinkle in.
Yeah, it really adds an extra level of relative intensity to the fight. Like I said, top 10 anime battles of all time. Crash and Aku Aku versus Cortex and Uka Uka.
For sure. That sounds like something that would feel like it could end the trilogy.
So once you defeat Cortex for the third and final time, so there's two different endings. Either A, you just defeat Cortex, but Uka Uka is still at large, and he says he's gonna go off and collect all the gems for his evil mastermind plan. Cortex has the line of, I'm gonna retire to a nice big island with a nice big drink, alongside a woman with nice big bags of ice for my aching head. Cortex is a man of culture. You need to get a GF with big bags of ice.
That's right. That's really what people need in life. They don't need anything else.
However, if you've collected not only all of the crystals, but also all of the gems, then after you defeat Cortex, then the time machine goes completely haywire because entropy isn't around anymore to keep it maintained, and it ends up creating a wormhole to another dimension which sucks up Cortex and Uka Uka to the other dimension. And the game just kind of ends with Aku Aku, Crash, and Coco just sitting by the fireplace like, whatever happened to those wacky villains we defeated? And then the game ends in the other dimension with a baby version of Cortex and baby Entropy arguing over who gets to control Uka Uka's mask powers. Because of the time machine going haywire, it de-aged them as well. So that's where the original trilogy ends for the most part. It's just Crash and Coco just living life, and Cortex and Uka Uka sealed away in another dimension.
That's quite an ending.
There was a fourth Crash game released on the PS1, Crash Team Racing, which was essentially the PlayStation's equivalent to Mario Kart. It's a racing game, but with Crash Bandicoot characters. So after Crash Team Racing, Naughty Dog gave the series over to a few different developers to make their own games, like Traveler's Tales, Vicarious Visions, and eventually Activision. And yeah, the series did go down in quality during this time. There were several Crash games released during the PlayStation 2 era, but they just didn't have the same charm as the first few games, and I don't know what they were doing with the art style in some of the later ones. Yeah, Crash buddy, what happened to you, man? And yeah, the Crash Bandicoot series just kinda drifted off into obscurity for a while. Usually most people just had nostalgia for the PS1 era games, but that was about it. The Crash series wasn't PlayStation's mascot anymore. But then in 2017, we got full remakes of the original trilogy, Crash Bandicoot The Insane Trilogy, which upgraded the graphics to the modern day, lets you play as Coco in each level, like you can swap in and out of her in Crash, and it just added some very nice quality of life features to everything. I think The Insane Trilogy is the best version of those games, but of course I'll always have a personal bias towards the originals. And after the success of the Insane Trilogy, we finally got our fourth official Crash Bandicoot game in 2020, Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time, which I think is a pretty clever name. Crash 4, it's a solid platformer. It's just a solid game. I recommend it to any Crash fan out there. But that's a discussion for another day. Alright, so to wrap things up, I guess we can kind of reflect on what is the legacy of the Crash Bandicoot original trilogy. I think Crash Bandicoot stands as one of the main platformer games out there. While it is true that prior to the Insane Trilogy and Crash 4, it wasn't a very prominent game series, and the games that we did get weren't the best, I think the legacy of the PS1 era lives on pretty firmly. It's a series that a lot of people have nostalgia over, and I think Crash is one of the more iconic platformer characters. And while Activision Blizzard did bring Crash back for one more game with It's About Time, they immediately killed him off afterwards. Now that Microsoft owns Activision, who knows what the future holds. And can I just say, it's really weird now that Crash Bandicoot is a Microsoft character.
Can you imagine if they do a crossover with Master Chief?
Oh boy.
That would be a time.
It's just really odd to me.
Master Chief, what are you doing, sir? I am playing with my Bandicoot.
Sounds like a euphemism for something.
No, it was just meant to be fun. Oh no.
For the PS1 at least, I think the Crash games were exactly what Sony was looking for in a mascot platformer game to compete with Mario and Sonic. While the series never quite got to the same cultural level of relevancy or mainstream attention that those two did, I do chalk that up to the direction the series took on in its later years. And of course, the biggest legacy that Crash Bandicoot leaves behind is with his developers, Naughty Dog. After the PS1, they would go on to do Jak and Daxter, another childhood favorite series of mine, Uncharted, and of course, The Last of Us, widely considered to be gaming's Citizen Kane by the pretentious gamers. But yeah, Naughty Dog, they're one of Sony's best partner studios, and it all started with a little crazy Bandicoot. And with that, thank you all again for listening to Backwards Compatible. If you'd like to give us any feedback or questions, then you can email us at backwardscompatiblepod@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.
Take care, y'all.